us off, and then as people come in, they can join. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 2022 Oregon Active Transportation Summit. My name is Anuksha Gardner. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Strategic Partnership Manager at the Street Trust. Welcome to Bridging Communities Through Active Transportation and Bus and Pedestrian Solutions for our Transit Network. Some housekeeping notes. You can type your questions in the chat or use the raise hand tool, both found at the bottom of your screen. Please use social media hashtag OATS22 to post about the summit on social media. And don't forget to visit our website at thestreettrust.org to learn more about our other programs and activities. Now, without further delay, please welcome to your screen, Nick and Sandra.
Great, thanks, Anusha. And welcome, thanks everyone for joining our presentation today. We actually have quite a bit of material to cover, so it may feel a bit rushed in our presentation, but we're happy to follow up with folks afterwards if there are more details and conversations that folks want to have. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully you can all see this now. And so, yeah, today we're gonna be presenting, Sandra and I. My name's Nick Gross. We'll cover a little bit more introductions here in a moment. But the presentation today is focusing on a conceptual idea to identify a new pedestrian and bicycle bridge between the city of Oregon City and West Linn, just south of Portland. And our presentation title is called Bridging Communities Through Active Transportation. So yeah, once again, my name is Nick Gross. I'm a transportation planner at Kittleson and Associates. My work primarily focuses on active transportation planning, a lot of conceptual design, and a lot of public facilitation, public processes, and community engagement. Sandra?
I'm Sandra Hikari, ODOT Major Projects Planner. I've been with ODOT nearly 10 years and focus on multimodal transportation planning in Region 1, focusing kind of Portland metro area as well as the Mountain Hood region. Thanks.
Awesome. So a little bit more background, just some more context on the larger project team. So this was a project we wrapped up in June of last year, so almost a year ago. The project team on the agency side, we have, of course, the cities of West Linn and Oregon City. This would be where the bridge connection would touch down on either side of the Willamette River. And then the Oregon Department of Transportation, Metro, and Clackamas County. And on the consultant team, Kittleson and Associates, we were the prime consultant, but we were very supported through a diverse team of other consultants and teaming partners. We had HDR, We All Rise, PKS International, and Concise Communications. So the presentation outline for today, Sandra is gonna cover the first half, starting with what we mean by bridging communities, a little bit more background context on the project, why we explored a new ped bike bridge here, ultimately the need for this new connection and the challenges that we face through this process. Sandra will also cover the diversity, equity, inclusion, and access that was integrated into this planning process and some of the newer framework and policies that ODOT has around DE&I. And then I'll cover the second half with some new technologies we use to address the unique challenges of this project, and then some innovative storytelling, again, aimed at addressing the unique challenges that we faced on this project. Okay, with that, I'll pass it to Sandra. Thanks.
Okay, great. So this is the historic Arch Bridge, the point of our conversation today. This was designed by Conda McCullough, and it was built in 1922. So it's a 100th year anniversary this summer. Next slide. And to provide a little context, we have looking to the east, we have Oregon City, and to the west, West Linn. To the north is the Abernathy Bridge, and in the center is the historic Arch Bridge, our current connection across the Willamette River. And to the south, where you can't see on the bottom there, is the Willamette Falls. And in the colored areas, we have the various historic and redevelopment areas. And then this map also shows some new transportation projects that haven't been built yet, like the roundabouts there. And so it's really timely conversation to identify a new pedestrian and bicycle bridge to connect these redevelopment opportunities and these new transportation projects. Next slide. So why do we need a new pedestrian and bicycle bridge? As you can see in this image to the right, the historic Arch Bridge has some constraints. You can see by the grade, it's greater than a 5% grade. The sidewalks there are about 4 feet and sometimes narrow in some sections, and bicyclists who use the bridge are sharing the roadway with vehicles. So currently the Arch Bridge serves the highly confident, so about 5% of the population. And so we wanted to create this plan to address or to create opportunities for the interested but concerned travelers, cyclists, and that would accommodate 70% of the population if we were to identify ped bike only bridge. And so, as I mentioned, the Arch Bridge has ADA challenges, and it makes it difficult and impassable for folks using mobility devices. Next slide. Also, looking at the larger context, the yellow line there shows the existing Arch Bridge and kind of our study area. And so a new ped bike bridge in the area would fill a significant 20-mile gap in the regional active transportation network. To the north, if the other bicycle connection or active transportation connection would be about 10 miles away, and about 11 miles to the Canby Ferry to the south. So that's going to either direction takes about an hour to bike to either of those facilities. Next slide. So this project, we encountered numerous challenges, things ranging from the technical and physical challenges of designing a bridge that met the 5% grade, because there were steep differences in topography on either side, either shoreline. We also had the challenge of incorporating diverse perspectives, also coordinating with the various transportation and redevelopment projects in the area. So the challenges were numerous, but for the purpose of this presentation, we'll be focusing on the challenges with integrating diversity, equity, inclusion, and access around planning in a culturally and historically significant location, implementing an kind of an equitable engagement framework, as well as engaging with communities during a global pandemic. And some of the challenges Nick will be addressing are understanding the key destinations and demand for new bridge. What are the destinations and how do we locate or the best connection? And then also assessing view sheds. Next slide. So this image here shows Willamette Falls. It's looking to the south, and you could see the paper mills on either side. Next slide. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and access is identified in ODOT's strategic action plan. This was developed last fall, and it has 3 pillars. One is an equity priority, another one is around sustainable funding, and another pillar around modernizing the transportation system. And with the equity priority, the goal is to utilize viewpoints of those who reside in communities that ODOT serves, who are likely to be affected by ODOT decisions, as well as including a broad section of voices in our processes to ensure issues ranging from ADA accessibility to economic impact to climate justice are factored into our decision making. So with this, we are further motivated to include DEIA in our work. Next slide. So one of the ways we included DEIA in this project is we started off by identifying key stakeholders, as well as identifying the key populations of those who've been historically marginalized or who have traditionally been underserved. And so the demographic mapping exercise identified people of color, Hispanic populations, elderly, as well as youth populations and individuals experiencing low income situations and crowded households. And I don't know if you could hear, but my dog is drinking water, so sorry about that distraction. So with that, we learned that in the Westland, Oregon City area, the largest populations impacted were youth and the elderly. And so we ensured that these populations identified here were included in the decision-making process. They were invited as participants in our stakeholder advisory committee and engaged through focus groups and included in the decision-making process. And we also did a stakeholder mapping exercise, which included placing all the stakeholders on a piece of paper and talking about which populations had the least access to transportation, and then who also had the least influence over a project like this in terms of not having access to the decision-making process. And so by identifying them, we were then ensured that we would elevate those voices and include them in our process. We also told the cultural history of place and the history of tribes with ties to Willamette Falls. Next slide. And so with the history of the cultural significance of this place, there's been a Native presence at Willamette Falls since time immemorial. And so we made sure that we told these stories during our virtual open houses and during our advisory committee meetings to reinforce that this is a significant place. We are initiating conversations with half a dozen tribes throughout the process, and engage with our tribal liaison to make sure that we were informing the tribes and also getting feedback on where is the best location for ped bike bridge alignment, what are some of the impacts that they foresee. And so the importance of storytelling, both from the Native perspective as well as through history, with the importance of the paper mills and the Willamette Falls electric power plant. And then we also learned through looking at historic photos and doing some research that there was a suspension bridge for pedestrians back in time before the historic arch bridge, which was used to as the temporary access. Next slide. And so with creating an inclusive engagement process, as I mentioned, we engaged with communities throughout the project with focus group and was able to offer compensation through ODOT's equity engagement compensation policy. We initiated tribal consultation and also invited them to participate in our project advisory committee. And that was a really actually engaging with them early and often was a key component of our decision-making process. We communicated to the advisory committee and the steering committee early on that we were elevating the voices of the historically marginalized communities and voices. And we heard some interesting perspectives through our conversations with the tribes, one of which is that, while we thought that creating a bridge connection closer to the Willamette Falls would be a benefit for all, we learned that many of the tribes did not prefer that alternative because they still engage in cultural activities and didn't want to be kind of a spectacle or looked upon. And so that was actually a less preferred alternative for several tribes. We, again, elevated the voices of historically marginalized. We engaged with focus groups, including youth, and heard about some of the benefits and burdens of the various alternatives. And, you know, towards the end, you know, we had several alignments, and it was interesting to hear that some of the private property owners, including PG and the paper mill sites, sort of, you know, put aside their own desires for a connection, a bridge connection to their properties, which would be an advantage to them, and said, we, you know, we would like the tribes to provide their interests, and we, yeah. So anyways, they put their priorities aside. And so that was one of the advantages of elevating their voices. Next slide. I think I pass it over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, the lots of challenges on this project. I'm going to speak to somewhat of two innovative solutions, I'll call them, to address the challenges of more holistically identifying a preferred alignment. So why would alignment A be better than alignment B? And thinking about the user and the demand that a given alignment would have. And then the second challenge that we found probably most unique to this project was the concern of view sheds. So we have the historical and cultural significant Arch Bridge, and of course the Willamette Falls. So two very significant assets in this area that a lot of concern about a new bridge obstructing views to these two assets. So the first technology to address the idea of, you know, or inform the idea of where a bridge alignment is best suited, we used a data set called Streetlight Data. And Streetlight Data is a company that works with big data. They pull cell phone pings or cell phone location service data from essentially everyone. If you have the location services turned on your cell phone, if for Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, they can actually pull your data. It's not you as an individual, but it is some number that they can then trace and understand travel patterns. So they aggregate that data down and essentially turn it into origin destination data to understand mobility patterns and travel patterns. So using this data as a platform, we created a ped bike travel demand model specific to our project area. And the polygons or the outlines that you see here in red are our zones, our transportation analysis zones, or maybe TAZs, as some people may have heard of these before. So these were uniquely identified by our project team, trying to understand the general breakpoints of land use and origin destination, essential destinations. So we ended up identifying 40 zones that we wanted specific streetlight data pulled from to understand how people are traveling today. We then created our own internal spreadsheet tool of a travel demand model based on the outputs of that streetlight data. And I want to specifically touch on some of the attributes that we included in that model and some of the assumptions. So the first was distance. This should all be thought about as accessing these future and potential bridge heads. So how far are people traveling to access a given bridge head on a given alignment? And then the further the distance, understanding that mode choice. So if it's shorter, we're seeing higher use of people walking. If it's longer, a bit more people biking. But around the 1 mile mark is where we start to see those numbers taper off. We also considered comfort, and we conducted what's called a level of traffic stress analysis to understand the comfort and experience of someone accessing a bridge head. So how how comforting or stressful is it to access that bridge head based on the existing facilities that exist today, as well as the planned facilities that have been adopted into the city's transportation system plans and are already planned for. A lot of other attributes we considered grade, so how convenient or not, thinking about elevation change to access a bridge head. So of course, if it's a steeper trip to access a bridge head, you may see less demand on that bridge head or bridge alignment. And then finally, connectivity, thinking about some of the barriers that people might face in accessing a given bridge alignment. And then a couple more softer assumptions that went into this model. So the historic arch bridge is not going anywhere. It is, again, as I've mentioned, a great asset. It's a very aesthetically pleasing bridge, and it's going to remain. And so while it is a barrier for some people using mobility devices and challenging for people walking and rolling with the shared lane, it still functions as a connection. So if it, we assume that if it provides the shortest path traveled for people walking, then they would likely still use the historic arch bridge today. For people biking, and for those who have biked across the historic arch bridge, from the West Linn to Oregon City direction, there's actually a fairly good downhill grade. So we assume that people biking would still bike from the West Linn to Oregon City direction, because you actually travel about 15 miles an hour or so, which is roughly the speed of vehicles. So it doesn't feel all that stressful. You're not feeling like you're holding up cars in the queue. Whereas if you're biking from Oregon City to West Linn, you're going much slower. And then recreational trips, we assume that all new recreational trips would use this new theoretical bridge alignment. These next couple slides are just quick outputs of what the model looks like. This is showing the baseline scenario of pedestrian trips. The darker colors today represent higher levels of travel, whereas the lighter are less. And then just two scenarios here. They might be a little bit hard to make out, but the baseline is on the left side of your screen. The middle image is this upstream alignment, so closest to the falls. And then on the right side of the screen, you're seeing that our downhill or our downstream alignment, which you can see those darker colors really beginning to pop up, which is representative of more demand for a downstream alignment. We analyzed 5 priority alignments, or 5 key alignments that sort of rose to the top based on a preliminary screening. And what you're seeing here on the right side of your screen is that graph of future trips. So these are new trips, as well as the potential for mode shift to occur. And that trend going upward from left to right is from the upstream to downstream. So the downstream alignments, we're seeing a much higher demand for walking and biking trips. We're pushing our time here, so I'm going to try to get through these ones relatively quickly. I think one of the more exciting pieces that I wanted to talk about is this innovative storytelling. We created a 3D model. I'm going to show a very quick video of what that looked like. And this was really aimed at getting to the concern of view sheds. So thinking again about where a given alignment is it obstructing the view shed looking at the historic arch bridge, or is it obstructing the view looking to the Willamette Falls from the historic arch bridge? So we created this model. It incorporates future planned development. I'm hoping everyone can see this. I can see Sandra and Zachary, thanks. So yeah, this is flying through, illustrating the future potential alignments. You can see a lot of the ramping structure that's required. A lot of our work was driven technically on grades, navigable clearance required from ships and the Coast Guard, and the ramping structures that require the bridge to get up high enough, elevated to meet that 5% minimum, as well as the clearance for navigable ships. The fly through going backwards is just down at at water level. So given we're running a bit short on time, I'm gonna exit out of this and wrap up here shortly. One last bit on the model that we created. We also had this user component to understand if you were to insert yourself within this model, somewhat of a virtual reality feature. So these eyeballs, you could actually go in, click on the eyeball, and then pop around to certain perspectives in the model. This is showing a perspective up on the Oregon City bluff that you can see the upstream alignment on the left side of your screen there, and then pivoting to the right, you can see the downstream alignment there. Here's a perspective, again, that you could just zoom in and pop yourself in on the water. You can just make out the upstream alignment underneath the historic arch bridge there. And then the downstream alignment here, much more present and in the foreground. So in conclusion, this planning process, it lasted about a year. We started with preliminary 7 options based on feedback from our project management team, our advisory committee, a leadership team, public comments, stakeholder interviews, a lot of tribal consultation that Sandra had mentioned. We identified specific groups to go out and focus on. The youth and the elderly were identified as groups that we didn't actually engage very well in our initial outreach. So we went back and specifically targeted those groups. And those 7 alignments morphed to 15. We then did an evaluation screen of the 15 to narrow down to the 5 most promising, which is what you saw in the model there. And ultimately, we ended up identifying 2 recommended corridors. So the narrative shifted from alignments to corridors. And that was really driven on a lot of the remaining unknowns of the area, a lot of the environmental, potential environmental impacts, historical and cultural impacts. And so these 2 green silhouettes or green boxes that you see here are the 2 preferred corridors. And right now, we are continuing to work with the cities of West Linn and Oregon City to get these 2 corridors adopted into their transportation system plans so that they are preserved and that future development would not preclude a bridge, a future ped bike bridge to occur in these green boxes that you see here. All right, that was a lot. I felt a little rushed, but hopefully it wasn't too fast. I think we just have a couple minutes for comments and questions, and I'm gonna take down the screen, and we're happy, of course, to follow up with folks afterwards as well.
If anyone has any questions or comments, you can either put it on chat or just unmute yourself and ask the presenters.
I had a question about, the bike and pedestrian infrastructure is as good as its weakest link. And I'm curious, and I'm not super familiar with that region. Can you talk a little bit about what the bridge or proposed bridge sites would connect to on either side?
Great question. I'm gonna go back and share the screen really quick. So today there's actually, so Oregon City is a pretty well-developed area. There's, of course, it's a pretty vibrant downtown. There's a well-established street grid, but on the West Linn side, it is much more rural. And so one of the significant components and assumptions that we built into this whole model and planned for are these streets that you're seeing right here in the forefront, which don't exist today. And so there is a parallel project going on. It's actually further along. It's the Willamette Falls Drive realignment project, which incorporates these new roundabouts. It's been adopted into the West Linn TSP. It has separated, fully protected bike lanes on both sides of the Willamette Falls Drive corridor, as well as the realignment of West A Street. So there is a lot of future planned active transportation facilities and investment in this area. But today, the question, it doesn't connect to a whole lot if you were to think about a new bridge today, but it will, by the time hopefully this ever gets built, it should be connecting to a much more comprehensive network.
There's a question in the chat. At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned people with disabilities and later ADA considerations. Did you have any on your planning team who are in this category?
Yes, we had a call for advisory committee members, had folks apply. We had several interested, and they kind of described their reasons, and we had one advisory committee member who spoke of, I guess, their disabilities and participated in the decision-making process.
Right. If you have any questions, you can type them in the chat, and there'll be some time later after the second presentation. And now I'll pass the mic or screen to Bryan and Esther.
Thank you. Esther is going to share her screen in a moment, and I'll start off the presentation. Hello, everyone.
Can you see my screen? Yeah, okay.
Yes. Well, I can. Can everyone else?
Okay. Yes.
Cool. All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to our session. We're here to talk to you today about bus and pedestrian solutions for our transit networks. Next slide. I am Bryan Blanc. I'm a data analyst in the Portland office of Nelson Nygaard, and this is muted, Esther.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. My name is Esther Needham. I'm an associate planner, also with Nelson Nygaard in the Portland office.
And next slide. So just a little bit of outline of what we're going to cover today. So we're going to talk about background and motivation for the whole project. We're going to touch on the kind of conceptual underpinnings of the bus delay analysis tool, which is going to pop up throughout the presentation today. Then we're going to delve into a case study of its application in Seattle, then demo a little bit of the tool, and then delve back into the case study after that. Next slide. So what is this bus delay analysis tool we mentioned, abbreviated BDAT, is this interactive dashboard that we're showing on the right, and we're going to pepper in throughout the presentation. It's a set of tools to diagnose areas of bus delay and plan for speed and reliability improvements. And the piece Esther is going to demo today is this project and treatment module that's shown on the right here. Next slide. So the background and motivation for this tool I just teased is buses are the workhorse of most transit systems, you know, and I think of relevance to folks at the conference today, you know, everyone who rides the bus is at some point an active transportation user. Showing a plot on the right here of proportion of passenger trips on the bus over time in like the top 20 urbanized areas in the US, courtesy of the National Transit Database. So in Seattle, buses make up 3/4 of the trips on their transit system, and about 90% of the service hours allocated. And in Portland, buses carry about 60% of riders before and during the COVID-19 pandemic. The kind of national average is about half of all riders in urban areas were on buses prior to the pandemic. And this proportion actually went up, especially in the beginning of the pandemic when kind of more discretionary commuter travel decreased on rail systems. Next slide. But buses are slowing down. As anyone who's out there on the road can attest, they're caught in the same general traffic trends that everyone else is. This is somewhat an old stat, but over about a decade, Trinet bus speeds declined by 9%. Next slide. And sorry, there's a bit of a lag. The thing I was going to mention was that TriMet spends about $1 to $2 million a year adding service service just to keep up with congestion, not actually adding new frequency. Can we figure out how to make the slide advance? Oh, okay, great. And so obviously this isn't actually making service more attractive for new riders, which is, you know, one of our main goals when we're planning transit. And so obviously it's an issue we want to solve for. So all that's kind of motivation for what we're going to talk about now, which is the bus delay analysis tool. Next slide. So we developed this in response to problems we were seeing across a lot of our transit agency clients. So these are kind of some of the top ones. Is where is transit delay happening? And we'll talk about what we define as transit delay, how many passengers are affected, what time of day is it happening, what direction, and a variety of other questions we strive to answer. Typical process issues are, so buses are, in most urban systems, are outfitted with AVL, which is automated vehicle location. So basically a GPS unit mounted on the bus, and automated passenger counter systems, which just count passenger ons and offs on the bus. These data sets, as you can imagine, end up pretty large and they're growing every day. And what happens a lot of times is the transit agencies use them for some high level performance statistics or just feeding to like third-party applications. Like it's how you can see where the bus is on Google Maps. But they aren't using them to measure detailed performance. And so just because the data sets get so huge, they're hard to deal with. So that was one of the things we want to address with this tool. Another key process issue is a lot of times transit agencies are analyzing service at a route level. And this makes it hard to understand where a particular street segment is served by multiple routes. And, you know, is the level at which we would assess, okay, are we going to do some kind of capital improvement to improve the speed of the bus for this street? Next slide. So all these kind of motivations resulted in this tool, which is allows transit agencies to understand bus delay throughout their networks in a data-driven way. It relies on the segment-based representation, which we'll talk a little bit more about. For an idea of scale for the Seattle area, this was 3,200 different segments, and relies on an interactive dashboard to make all of the data that we're analyzing a bit more accessible to the client. Next slide. So transit delay. There's no textbook definition to refer to for this. We developed this definition to like get at the problems that a lot of different agencies were seeing. Basically, we define delay as the difference between a relatively good travel time on a given segment of roadway for a given trip and a relatively bad travel time for that same trip and same segment of roadway. We typically are using the 80th and 20th percentile to represent those kind of good and bad travel times, and the difference between them being segment delay. We then summed that up over the course of a day and for every segment and route. And then we also weighted that by average onboard load to understand, you know, how many passengers it was affecting, and also tried to normalize that in various ways to, for example, represent how much service was being provided on a given segment. Next slide. Another key definition is what are we talking about when we're talking about segments? So the starting place for segmenting a network was to divide it wherever routes converged or diverged, so you could describe every single bus route in terms of a series of roadway segments. But we also created new segment splits wherever there was like a key intersection that we knew was causing congestion issues, or there was another kind of major modal intersection, like with a rail system. Next slide. So we originally developed this tool as kind of this first step on the left, you know, helping us identify problem areas. But then a natural next step was to then take those problem areas and try to develop potential solutions and evaluate those solutions. And Esther is going to demo the solution development piece and then talk a little bit about the evaluation. Next slide. And just taking one more step back, where does all this fit into like a typical transit analysis project lifecycle? So as transit planners, we're always responding to real world conditions and using our various measuring tools like the AVL and APC readers to abstract those real world conditions into performance metrics. We then take all those measurements and use them to identify problem areas, which is what we did initially with the BDAT tool. And then next, we're developing and evaluating potential solutions to those issues. And then hopefully, if we've done our jobs well, those solutions get designed and then implemented. And then we see new real world conditions that we can then analyze again and keep iteratively improving. Next slide. Okay, so with that, I'm going to hand it off to Esther to talk through the case study.
Thanks, Brian. Hopefully these slides are not getting too laggy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we did with Seattle. So we were working recently with the Seattle Department of Transportation on a project that was focused on speed and reliability improvements for the bus network. And we had a number of different questions we were trying to answer, as well as developing some conceptual treatments. So one question was, where should we prioritize speed and reliability improvement? So where are the areas of highest need? And what would be the treatments or improvements that would have the biggest impact? So what should we implement? And how much are they going to cost? And how can we prioritize amongst those? So we use the tool that Brian's been talking about to try to help us answer some of these questions. So the first step was to identify those areas of highest need. So to do that, we had a couple of different criteria that we were using to kind of filter down the overall segment network. So we have the entire King County Metro network segmented, but we filtered it down to Seattle. And then we're looking at just the frequent network, excluding freeways and excluding downtown Seattle, because that had some of its own planning processes going on. And then we wanted to find the segments with the highest passenger delay. So we were looking at passenger delay rather than segment delay on its own, because as Brian mentioned, passenger delay is weighted by load. So it's looking at where are the areas with a lot of delay that are affecting the most people. And then once we had those kind of set of segments narrowed down, we wanted to group them together into logical corridors or spots. So like Brian was mentioning, segments can be rather short, kind of depending on how much service there is in an area and how many intersections or arterials are crossing. And so there might be a situation where we have several contiguous segments or several segments kind of near each other that we could group together to make something like a little bit more of a logical geography. So once we did that, we wanted to say like, okay, amongst all these areas that we've identified, how can we prioritize the ones that we actually want to provide conceptual treatments for? So to do that, we produced a transit score and an equity score, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And then we kind of prioritized amongst those areas of highest need, looking at those pieces of data. And then as we were doing this, we were realizing that we were finding a lot of areas that had also been identified previously. So we're using this very quantitative process, and it's showing us areas that the city already knows are issues. And so some of them had already been identified, and some of them already had planned and funded projects. And some of them already had projects that had been completed, because we were doing this work in 2020 and 2021, but we were using fall 2019 data. So if there was a project that had been completed after fall 2019, we would be seeing the delay from before that time. And we were using fall 2019 because 2020 data is obviously a little bit unreliable. So it was kind of good news to us that we were finding areas that had also been found by other people. So to talk a little bit more about the equity score. So this was made up of two primary pieces of information. One was the area of need score. So that's something that was already developed and the region is using to look at equity. It's a block group level measure. So it's made up of several different pieces of demographics from the census, including persons of color, poverty, limited English proficiency, disabled population, and foreign-born population. So it's a block group level measure, and we were able to kind of bring that up to those segment groups and get a score. And then there's also something called high opportunity routes. So this is a route level measure. It's a 1 to 5 score that's based on the percent of stops for a route within the area of need block group. So it's kind of derived from that original data set. And a score of 4 or 5 is considered a high opportunity route. So we looked at those segment groups and counted how many routes with a high opportunity score are using those different areas. And then the transit score was made up of some of the data that we had generated. So we were looking at passenger delay, segment delay, reliability, which is kind of a combination of a couple different values, frequency, load, and then the COVID route identification. So COVID routes are an analysis that we did to look at kind of which routes were retaining the most ridership during the COVID-19 pandemic, and routes that maintained a lot of ridership during a time where a lot of people were opting out of using transit indicates routes that serve people that are transit dependent. So those are important to make sure that we're providing good service for. So once we had kind of narrowed down our areas that we were going to plan for, we need to look at like what are the different types of treatments that we're going to use. And so we worked really closely with the city to come up with a long list of different treatment types, and they were kind of grouped into these different categories. So I just wanted to highlight the pedestrian accessibility treatments. So this project was focused on bus speed and reliability, but as we were working with our clients, we realized that like when they're doing improvement projects throughout the city, they often are then including other things like pedestrian accessibility treatments. So even though those specific things might not be adding a benefit to bus delay, it's something that they're going to be doing anyway to improve the area, and they want to be able to plan for those and know how much they might cost and incorporate that into their estimates. So we included some treatments for this, which you'll see in the demo. And it's something that we've been thinking about more and more. And we are doing this process again right now with Denver, and we actually have a longer list of pedestrian accessibility treatments that they're looking at. And it would be possible in this tool to also include other things like bike lanes and stuff. We actually don't have that in this example, but I think when you see it, you'll understand that it could be expanded. And this list of treatments is customized every time we do this. And so we had that list of treatments, and then we were looking at the King County Metro guidelines for which types of treatments you would use in different situations. So we're analyzing each location and trying to understand what might be causing the delay there, and providing some treatments. Okay, so I'm going to jump into a demo of the tool. Brian, could you let me know if you all are seeing the change screen?
Yep, I see that.
Okay, great. So like Brian mentioned, the BDAT tool has a lot of different features, and there's a lot of different things you can do with it. And this is just one little slice. But we have this tool where you can kind of plug and play with different treatment types to get those estimates of benefit and costs like we were talking about. So this is just a demo location. This is not something they're actually planning to do necessarily, but this is on Northwest Market Street. And so this is kind of what it looks like when you start a project. You can select your location, and you can create a name and description, name your directions, but then you can start adding treatments. So this is the list of treatments that we have, and you can see they're organized in those different buckets that I mentioned. And there's a lot of stuff in here, so definitely not going to go through all of it, but I'll just show what it looks like to add a few different ones. So transit signal priority is one of the treatment types that we use a lot. And you can see we have a lot of different options here to customize it, including major and minor. And we have different information about, what is the assumption there? What is the different costing options? So to create this, you're going to select the signals that you want. And we have built out a signal database that's using the data from the city as well as OpenStreetMap data to kind of capture all of the existing signals, so that when you're adding TSP, you can select from places that actually exist. We also have a treatment type to add new signals if you want to do that. And you can select what direction they go in. We have a default assumption for every treatment type of what would the delay reduction be. And it's customizable. And let's say in this area, you think that TSP will have like a little bit less benefit or a little bit more, you can kind of crank it up or down. And then I'll show adding a fat lane. So for lanes, you can select your extent by kind of clicking on the segments. But you want to be able to customize how long it is, and if it doesn't really match the segment extent, you can split the segments. and then toggle off kind of the ends that you don't want included. So that's the extent of this lane. Again, there's a lot of different options here. We also have operating hours and treatment benefit hours. This is something that's really helpful with transit lanes, because you could kind of select the hours based on, if you wanted like a peak only lane, you could toggle off some of the hours of the day, and you could affect the delay reduction that way. And then I'll add one more thing. So we could add an RRFB. So these are point locations. You can kind of just drop these anywhere. So when we did this, we did a lot of research on these separate locations to figure out kind of what types of treatments we wanted, and would know, like where you want to be placing these items. Okay, so you can review this and save it back to the database, and then it's available to use. And the way that works is once you kind of create a project in the tool and save it, you can then add them into alternatives, and you can mix and match projects across alternatives. So if this is the extent of kind of spot location that you want to look at, you can develop different projects and kind of decide like, okay, in alternative 1, I want to use project A and project B, and in alternative 2, I want to use project B and project C, and you can kind of like plug and play to experiment with what might have the biggest benefit. And these are the kind of results that we are able to produce from the tool. So you can see the kind of existing conditions data of, what is the extent, how many miles is it, what is the existing delay, what would the estimated reduction be, the % reduction, and what would the cost be. So for Seattle, we actually just had one bucket of cost information, but like I mentioned, we're doing this for Denver right now, and they wanted to split out their treatments by speed and reliability treatments, which are things specifically for the bus, and then things that are for pedestrians. So it's split out by Vision Zero. So whenever you're developing an alternative, you can see the different funding buckets. And they wanted that so that they could kind of track that through their process and be able to look for funding in different ways. And then we also have the delay benefit broken out by hour of the day. So you can estimate like peak delay benefit, for example. So finally, once we did this for many different locations, we were able to produce those estimated costs and benefits for each one. And we wanted to be able to kind of prioritize amongst those. We also created like a lot of different like cut sheets and statistics. It's all kind of internal right now, so I'm just kind of showing you examples, but this is like some of the statistics we were able to create and like visuals on the side here, as well as a lot of different maps. But for the prioritization, we use the equity score and transit score that I talked about before to create like a need score. And then we looked at the costs and benefits. So what were the costs? What's the estimated delay reduction? What is the delay reduction per like dollar of project cost essentially? And then based on the prioritization and the cost and the need, you can kind of group them together into different funding scenarios. So if you know you want to be able to spend X amount of dollars in 1 to 2 years and you want to get this amount of benefit, you could kind of like section out the different things, and maybe in 10 years you have this much money, and we can kind of like plan for it that way so that they can start applying for funding. Okay, so that's all we have for you today. I know there's a lot of different information. The application that I was demoing, there is actually a demo version of that is open to the public to access. So if you all are interested in that, shoot us an email or go to that tiny URL and we can send you the link to demo and you can play around with it. And certainly if you have any questions, reach out to us. And I think we have a few minutes left for questions right now.
Esther, there's a question in the chat for you. It says, you mentioned the quant data often confirmed the qualitatively identified problem areas. How often did the quant data suggest a problematic area that wasn't supported by the qualitative observation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that I have like a number specifically. And I guess I should also say that some of those previously identified locations may have been qualitative, but some of them were probably also quantitative, but it was like data that was not produced by us. It was something that the transit agency was using looking at route level data. But I think that the benefit of the way that we have analyzed this information is that it's on street segments rather than at the route level. So it's easier to identify kind of smaller locations where many routes might be using a certain intersection, and they're all getting a little bit of delay there, where you might not be noticing that across an entire route, but when you're looking at it at the street level, you're like, oh, okay, like this area is a problem for all of the routes. If that makes sense.
We have 4 minutes for any questions for Bryan and Esther, or for Nick and Sandra, if you have any.
One other thing I can add on that last question is that when we've done this before, we've done it in other locations, including in Portland. One thing that we noticed that I think was a surprise, maybe Bryan can speak to this a little bit more, was that transit centers were often popping up as locations of delay. And that hadn't been something that had necessarily been focused on prior. So that was an interesting finding.
Yeah, we saw transit centers being definitely one category. And we saw a variety of like spot locations mostly, where, you know, TriMet wasn't aware of this being a problem area prior, and we were able to help them kind of put things on the map for their future project pipelines.